3 News Now Web Extra.
So, Sarah, we spoke a little bit about the case in Lincoln today, and one of the arguments the defense made was that the woman in this case never explicitly said no. Could you address some issues around consent, especially with intimate partners on college campuses and dating on college campuses, and even what you see in Nebraska, saying no, seeking consent, and also feeling comfortable explaining what you are and aren't comfortable with when it comes to a sexual encounter?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot to unpack in that question. There's a lot to unpack even when we talk about the definition of consent. Nebraska sets out a definition. You can look up online the legal definition of consent, which kind of lays out the different elements at play. And I think the Nebraska law does actually cover quite a bit. And one of the parts I always emphasize when I'm training different groups, when I'm educating folks about consent, is there's a really important element in that definition that talks about, and I'm going to read it so that way I don't botch it a little bit, but there's an element where they include the victim need only resist either verbally or physically to make the refusal genuine and real, right? So they do acknowledge that it can be either verbal or physical, because I think sometimes when we talk about consent, especially when we're training on it, we talk about the yes means yes, no means no. But when you think about actual sexual encounters, it's very rare that we see people actually saying, hey, is it okay if I kiss you here? Okay, yes. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Is it okay if I touch you here? Right? That's very stilted. It's not natural. It's not realistic of how sexual encounters happen, right? And so the law does kind of cover that, and including, not just verbal, but also physical refusal. That's another really important element of consent. But then the next piece in there is that a victim need not resist verbally or physically where it would be useless or futile to do so, right? And of course, with any law, it's a little bit vague. So we have to look at the situation specifically to understand how that's going to be interpreted. But I think that is a really important piece too, because, I could resist, but if the person who is trying to engage in a sexual activity with me, and I don't want to consent, but if that person is significantly larger than me, if they are in they have a weapon or some other mechanism to harm me, I may be too afraid to even try to say no or to push back. And so the law does kind of incorporate that as well. Of course, depending on specific cases, and I don't know all of the specific details of this case, it can be interpreted in different ways. But I think when we think about the definition of consent, it's important to keep in mind that what the legal definition is kind of our bare minimum, right? It's covering the very bare minimum of what needs to happen. If we really want to engage in sexual activities in a healthy way, and especially in relationships, we are going to really want to go above and beyond that definition, to have a lot of communication, to be able to really build up the ability to read one another's nonverbal cues as well. So defining consent, I think, is always kind of tricky because there's a legal definition, but it can be so much more than that to really be engaging in a very, more positive, more interactive way.
Something that comes up in these cases too is it possible to have consent if someone is under the influence of drugs or alcohol?
That's a really great question. So the law, of course, is a little bit vague on this. The law does say that if someone is intoxicated, you cannot consent, but they don't designate what intoxicated is, right? What that blood alcohol point is, because again, for everyone, it's a little bit different. For me, right, 1.5 glasses of wine and I'm probably good. For my boyfriend, he could drink like a case of beer and still be fine. And so, there's that flexibility in the law to take into account all of those different factors of different folks' capacity for alcohol and other drugs.
Is there anything else that we all could know at any age, not just, we think about young people on campuses, but it's more than that. So is there anything that we should all know about consent that we haven't addressed or that you haven't had a chance to talk about yet?
Yeah, I think when we think about consent, I think a lot of times it feels like this intimidating thing or this legal structure, but the reality is that we engage with consent on an everyday basis, right? We consent all the time or withhold our consent all the time of, whether I'm willing to, give you a hug or not, whether I'm willing to, do I want to go get a drink with a coworker? I could consent or not. Do I want to, all of these different elements, we engage with consent all the time. And so I think a lot of times it feels really intimidating. Hey, I'm afraid that I'm not getting consent, but I don't know. But the reality is we practice this all the time. And so I think it's important for folks to remember that so that we can realize that this isn't so intimidating. It's not scary. It's just about respecting another person's boundaries, right? It's about checking in with them, making sure that you know their boundaries and knowing that, I may know their boundaries once, but then next week, next month, their boundaries may change, right? Think about the pandemic. A lot of our boundaries are changing as far as, what different folks are comfortable in doing. And so that's really true when we're talking about sexual experiences as well. Our boundaries may change from day to day. And that's why it's always important to keep checking in with folks and keep having those conversations because, none of us are mind readers. None of us can always know what the other person is thinking. And so it's just as simple as a quick check-in.
How common is it in some of these cases, going back to just people reporting sexual assault? Because we know that first of all, I want to know how often people simply don't report sexual assault, if we have any numbers on that. And then of the people who do report rape or sexual assault, how common is it for them to actually be lying about it or making it up?
Yeah, really, really important question. So the first one I can give you off the bat, the number of false reports of sexual assault, it's about 2 to 8% of any reports made are false reports. 2 to 8%. That's really, really low. That's about the same as you would see for any other federal crime. And so we see a really low rate there. As far as folks actually making reports, I want to give you the specific number. So I can, if it's okay, I'll email you afterwards with the number and source to make sure I'm accurately telling you. But I believe it's about 60% of assaults are never reported. So it's a really actually pretty low number of people who do report the sexual assault to, and this is to law enforcement. Folks may report to other, people in their life, but for law enforcement, it's pretty low.
Well, I'm sure in your business you see people who come in for counseling that seek help for it, but they just never took it to law enforcement.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Okay. And how common, kind of along those lines, how common is it for intimate partners to just, if you have a sense of how common it is for sexual partners to have a misunderstanding about when there was consent and when there wasn't consent?
Yeah, that's a good question too. I think it would be fairly common, the more, as I've been in the field, I think I've been seeing more and more stories and research on how often sexual assault happens without the perpetrator realizing that what they did was committing sexual assault. And we even see victims who don't necessarily process what they experienced as sexual assault, even though it would fit the legal definition of assault because there wasn't that consent there. Because I think, we still have this legacy, it's been 3 decades now, which is not very much time since the first laws went on the books about marital rape and saying that just because you're married doesn't mean that it's a free-for-all. You still have to get consent from your partner. Previous to that, if you raped your partner, but you were married to them, it did not count as rape, as sexual assault under legal guidelines. And so I think we still have a long legacy of that idea that just because you're in a committed relationship, that automatically means you're giving consent to your partner all the time, when that just simply isn't true. People can decide to withdraw their consent for any number of reasons on any given day. And it doesn't matter, if you've been married to that person, if you've been in a relationship with that person, or if this is someone that you're, your first time engaging in sexual activities with them. But for those reasons, I think we see that it can happen pretty often where sexual assault happens with, especially the person committing sexual assault not realizing that that's what they've done.
Societally speaking, do you see that do you have any sense if there's an improvement or not an improvement in terms of just our awareness around consent and people feeling a certain amount of entitlement when perhaps they should or shouldn't? Do you see any changes in that in our society, or do you, again, kind of curious what your thoughts are on that?
Yeah, I would say we have seen improvement. I think, for me, it goes back to the Me Too movement, the hashtag Me Too, which was several years ago now, feels like even longer than that with the way the past year has been. But when that came out, working in this field, I was like, oh, that's awesome. This is great to see folks speaking up and telling their truths. This is going to pass in a month. It's great. It'll catch headlines for a month, maybe, and that'll be it. But really what we've seen is that Me Too movement has carried forward for a long time. It's still, it's gone down a little bit, and we're seeing less, high profile cases in the news. But I think the conversation is still happening. I am seeing, in the work that I do in the community, there is a lot more awareness and acceptance that, yes, this is happening here. Whereas I think before it was a lot easier for folks to say, sure, it's happening, but it's not happening here. It's not in my community. It's not an issue for us. Whereas I do think we're seeing a pretty big shift in folks at least taking that first step of recognizing that this is a problem, and it's a problem here in my community. We've got a ways to go before we are actually actively preventing the violence, but I think the awareness has definitely increased in recent years.
Well, since I've got you on the phone, I think one thing that I would love for you to address too is that we know, women aren't the only victims of sexual assault. Do you, or are there other agencies in Omaha who work with both men and women when it comes to rape and sexual assault?
Yes. This is one of the things that I share most often. Our name is very misleading. It's the Women's Center for Advancement. We really try to go by the WCA because we do serve everyone of any gender. We know that anyone can become a victim of sexual violence, domestic violence, human trafficking, and stalking. And so we do serve everyone. Men are much less likely to come forward after experiencing sexual violence for a lot of different reasons. Part of it is shame and stigma. Part of it is, as a culture, we don't talk about men experiencing sexual violence. So I think there are men who are assaulted who don't recognize that experience as sexual assault because they don't know that men can be assaulted. And then we don't really make it clear that men can receive services either, which they definitely can. There's lots of services available. So, you can come to the WCA for services. There are other organizations. So Heartland Family Services also kind of serves the general Omaha area, and across the state, services are available for male survivors as well.
And if someone has experienced an assault, what is the first thing that they should do? Or, whether it's fresh or it was years ago, what are some recommendations that you would have for them if they need to seek help?
Yeah. So my first recommendation, if the assault was recent, my recommendation would be to go to the hospital first. This is a really important step, just to make sure that your physical safety is checked out. We want to make sure that if there's any injuries, that you'll be able to get those addressed. If you do go, I believe 72 hours is the window after you've been assaulted, they will also collect evidence They'll do a forensic exam with a forensic nurse. And so all of that evidence can be collected. And there's a variety of options for reporting when that happens. So please, if you are recently assaulted, try to get that medical help. We want to make sure that you're supported in that way. And then from there, I would reach out to whoever feels safe for you. Of course, I always recommend folks to reach out to the WCA. We've got a 24-hour hotline that you can call to, that's always a good first step to just say, hey, this is what happened. What do I do next? And we can help to kind of give you some options, help you to understand what those options could look like for you in each particular situation. But sometimes calling the WCA doesn't feel like the right option, or it's scary. And so, I would talk to a trusted person in your life as well. Folks who are on campus when we're looking at our students, or faculty on campus, you can also reach out to support on campus. There's a lot of resources there as well.
And, now as we're kind of ending a very weird school year, we have a lot of seniors graduating and heading off to college. What should the parents of those young adults be telling their kids as they head off to college when it comes to prevention of sexual violence or their response to sexual violence should it happen to them?
Yeah. I would recommend that parents really have open and honest conversations with their students. And again, I want to emphasize not just with your female students, with everybody, because this is not an issue that just affects women. It affects everyone. Everyone can help to prevent the violence, and everyone can be potentially a victim. So we really need all voices in the conversation. But I would really encourage parents to just talk about what students should expect. Talk about maybe what your family values are, but as much as you can, giving space for students to ask questions in a non-judgmental space so that, they can, get out some of those questions that they may have. They may not understand what consent means or looks like. They may not understand all of these different elements. And, I think the hardest part for me is seeing students who just have never had any of these conversations, and so are completely blindsided when an assault happens to them, or when they find out later that they committed assault but had no idea that that's what was happening because no one had a conversation with them about what consent should look like, about what respectful relationships should look like. So as awkward and uncomfortable as it can be, talk to your students or find someone who can. Reach out and find someone who can help to guide that conversation for you.
And I'm glad you touched on that, because I was going to ask, I think a lot of people don't know when they're teenagers and young adults what a healthy expression of sexuality is a lot of times. And we have a lot of unhealthy examples probably in pop culture. Access to pornography is widespread now. Are there any other tips that you would give to parents about how to discuss those issues with their kids, with their young adults, so they know what a healthy sexual life should look like?
Yeah. So I think you can integrate it in a lot of different ways. One thing would be, if you ever have family movie nights, when you're sitting down watching the same show or the same movie, you can pick up a conversation after that and talk about if there were any relationships portrayed in that film or in that TV show. Have a conversation. What looked healthy? What didn't? What stood out to you? Sometimes that's a great starting point if you can pull on pop culture, or if you're listening to a song on the radio, and you can be like, whoa, this doesn't sound very healthy. What do you think about this? There's no really right or wrong answer for how to have the conversation. You can also do a Google search. There are so many different resource guides out there, discussion guides out there. There's books about this. So don't feel like you have to be alone and just guess on how to start the conversation. Parents all over are trying to figure this out. So there's a lot of resources. The key is just to start the conversation. Don't be so afraid about how awkward it's going to be or that you're going to do it wrong that you never do it, because that's really the worst thing we can do.